Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our series of mini interviews with important figures in environmental and environmental justice and the climate crisis that is known to us here at Elliott Church. And I've been looking for guidance that I can pass along to the congregation and to the leadership here. And so I've turned to Vince Maraventano because of his bird's eye view on this very complicated and involved set of issues around the climate crisis. Vince Maraventano just retired recently after 12 years as the executive director of Massachusetts Interfaith Power and Light. And after getting his law degree from Boston College Law School years back, he was senior counsel to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, which has got to be a heavy-hitting intersection, a heavy-hitting job in an intersection of a lot of legal conflict around the environment. He was there for 12 years. And then he took a theological degree, which makes him a man after my own heart, and became a hospital chaplain, which eventually led him back to climate change. Vince lives with his family in West Roxbury and has been a member of Elliott Church for these 21 years. So what we're going to do here is in the nature of a fireside chat, or, if we could, it would be a cozy conversation at an Irish pub. But here we are in a Zoom meeting. So I just want to start off by saying we will always have a part to play, all of us as citizens. No matter what direction this election goes, we will have a role to play. And it's for that reason that I wanted us to cover a few subjects, get Vince's advice about a few pointers, like what kind of action would he recommend around environmental activism? What about the relationship between the virus and climate change and and healthcare? I'd also hope we can touch on what things he's reading that he likes, that he thinks we should be acquainted with, what organizations are the lively ones to belong to or to contribute to. How about renewable energy technologies? Things are changing all the time. If there's something there we should know. And finally, I hope we can get to personal practices. I know I have a good feeling that those will continue pretty much the same as ever, but we'll learn more from Vince. So listen, let's start off. Vince, welcome, and thanks for agreeing to take this on. We'll chat for about 20-25 minutes and see what we can learn. So here's your choices. Where would you direct us? To legislative advocacy, to direct action like rallies or marches, or education like church programming? What would you say to your church?
Well, Rick, I think all of those are important. And I've been involved in each of those. I think it's important for people to sort of think about this as they might think about whether they have a calling, and see really what arena their hearts and their faith draw them to. Because I do think, God calls us into the work that we're meant to do. I use myself as an example. I chose Boston College Law School over several other prestigious schools because Robert Drinan had been the dean, and they had a public policy focus, and that's the work that I wanted to do as a lawyer. That was back in the late 70s, where there were not as many courses in this area, but the one I took at BC Law was called Environmental Enforcement, with a guy by the name of Greg McGregor, who was the head of the Environmental Protection Division in EPA. Many years later, when I went to DP, I was working side by side with the lawyers in the Environmental Protection Division, surprisingly. Towards the end of that career, I felt called to ministry. I got my MDiv, and after I graduated, one of my fellow students said, and I was working as a chaplain, he said, there's an advocacy effort going on by the faith community to try and get the Global Warming Solutions Act passed. Maybe you should talk to them. So I did, and we walked around the State House trying to persuade the legislators to pass the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008. And in that work, I met Stephen McGosselin of Mass Interfaith Power and Light. And he said, hey, we've got a job as a community organizer here. Are you interested? I took that, and, not that long after, they said, hey, why don't you become the executive director? So, that clearly was a little bit like the story of Jonah and the whale. I was going in one direction, and I loved hospital chaplaincy, but God just sort of turned me back around. And, in faith communities, I do think, it's important that we focus on the moral component of this issue, the justice component of this issue, because, people have been grappling with facts and figures around climate change since, I think at least 1992, when it was widely perceived. And it's just polarized things. But I think if people focus on, the just devastating impacts on the poor and the young and frame it as a moral issue, it's easier to reach people's hearts. And ultimately what gets people to act is what touches their hearts.
Well, the fact that you wound up after chaplaincy, or let's say through chaplaincy back to environmental issues, suggests to me that this was a passion that had never evaporated in you going back to your youth. What was it that got you started in the first place to set out for a degree in environmental law? That's a tall order.
Yeah, well, so I graduated from college in 1972, and at that, that was 2 years after the original Earth Day of 1970. So it was a big issue. It was a big issue on Long Island, where I went to college at Stony Brook. So I think, that's where the specific idea took hold. But I think with many things, we are drawn into relationships maybe even earlier than we actually realize. So, I was born in Brooklyn, and my grandfather used to take me on walks up to Prospect Park with, a big Olmsted designed park. And it was an escape from the city. And, it was a great experience for me because, he was one of the people that I loved the most. So I think probably, the roots of a relationship with nature come from him. And, his father had immigrated from Italy, and he was a tenant farmer. And my grandfather was always very tuned to how much rain there is and what the weather is and, what the trees can do. And, he passed that passion on to me.
Well, that's a great testament to Olmsted. I mean, here, his whole career, his vocation was the creation of these natural surroundings in the middle of cities.
Right.
Most famously, New York Central Park and Prospect Park, and of course, here in Boston, the Emerald Necklace. And here you're one of the illustrations of why that's important. It feeds our souls at a very, very basic level. Listen, I know that you were deeply involved in lobbying at the legislature here at the State House in Massachusetts, in Boston. And we can't go into all the ins and outs of that, but I just wonder if you don't mind, you're off the top of the head, how do you rate the Massachusetts legislature and legislators on this issue? I mean, are we in an environmentally friendly state compared to the others? or is
Yes, yes, we definitely are. And let me first say, I was talking about, calling and having gotten involved in the lobbying work on behalf of the Global Warming Solutions Act. In law school, I worked as a congressional intern in Washington, D.C. I worked as a legal intern at the Massachusetts House of Representatives, prepared testimony for congressmen, gave testimony in the State House. So I had that background, and sort of that's what came naturally to me. I did not have the background of marching in major demonstrations, although I have done that since. Yes, Massachusetts has been in the forefront on this for many years. I remember when I was at DP, a private consultant who came in response to an enforcement action said to me, Massachusetts is one of the 4 states in this country that has the most progressive environmental laws and environmental ethic. And that has been the case for a long time. Right now, the Senate has the strongest bill that they've passed in terms of climate change. Governor Baker has publicly endorsed the goal of net zero carbon by 2050, which the Senate has also, and the House has as well. The House has been for many years the laggard here. And I guess the proof I would offer is, despite the fact that we had 95 co-sponsors for the carbon pricing bill that we fought for many years, which is a majority of the House, the bill did not get out of committee because the chair, who takes his orders from Speaker DeLeo, would not put it out of committee. Despite that, they have passed a 2050 roadmap bill. Similarly, sets a goal of net zero carbon by 2050, intermediate goals of 50% by 2030, 75% by 2040. So, there's a lot of, as people sometimes pejoratively refer to as sausage making in this process. It's a very, very dynamic, fluid, at times frustrating and exasperating process. But our state officials are definitely out front on this. The real challenge is just to get those 3 branches to sort of somehow coalesce in their goals.
Well, the import of what you're saying seems to be that our focus and our energy and the pressure should go onto the House, the representatives, and that we should be keeping our eye on our personal representative and follow through with that. I couldn't help but mention that when we lived in the Berkshires for 12 years, Berkshire County, it wasn't infrequently that we would see a green pickup truck labeled environmental enforcement. I know it didn't say police, but it was.
Oh, there are environmental police.
Well, maybe it did then, but yeah. It sure showed that there's a commitment to seeing, to project the importance of keeping these laws that people pass. Well, look, let's ask a contemporary question. What have your thoughts been, and what do you hear about the connection between the virus and the environment, the virus and climate change?
Well, as many members of the congregation know, my wife Sue is a nurse at Mass General. I just had hip replacement in the end of June, from which I'm recovering very well. So I was in conversation with nurses and physical therapists and doctors on this. And they all agree that, the healthcare system is not meeting the needs of the poor and people of color. And it takes a crisis like this to put the spotlight on that fact. And unfortunately, it's, when people are dying, when people go broke because they don't have insurance, that the public becomes sensitized to that. It's the same situation with respect to climate change. whether it's intense storms or coastal flooding, typically affects low-lying areas like East Boston and Winthrop, and poorer populations most severely. The biggest connection, is that fossil fuel emissions cause air pollution, which cause and worsen asthma. And Black and Latinos have 2 to 3 times the death rates, as whites. Massachusetts is typically rated the most energy efficient state in the country. Occasionally California comes in first. But those of us on the ground know that those programs, while they're good, they do not work as well in real poor communities like Lawrence and Roxbury. And it's because they're based on contractors who are there for profit, and they don't like working in those areas. This is why we've been actively pushing for environmental justice language at the state level. And the 2050 Roadmap Bill, Joan Moschino's bill, which passed the House, did include the environmental justice language that had been present in some of the bills co-sponsored by Black and Latino legislators. So now this goes to the conference committee, and the Senate and the House have to come up with final language, but we are pretty optimistic that environmental justice language will make it into a final law.
I attend the Black Ministerial Alliance meetings from time to time, much less so now that we're in this lockdown. But at the early stages of it, I attended and happened to ask, where do your congregants, these are folks who live primarily in Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan, where do they go for their medical services when they have an emergency and so forth, or any kind of medical need? And I was surprised, I don't know if I should have been or not, but I was surprised that they mentioned, Brigham or Boston
Medical Center.
Medical Center. Nobody referred to something local. There was no neighborhood. They didn't refer to a neighborhood clinic or anything like that. And I wondered about whether that also contributes to, their mortality, not having access to good care close by. Well, listen, let's touch on another subject. What are you reading, Vince, and what do you recommend? I know you sent me something by email here. Tell me about which of these you recommend. Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis by Leah D. Shade and the Reverend Dr. Margaret Bullitt Jonas. Voices of Courage.
Yeah, working at House of Worship for 12 years, very often we see that there are a small number of champions or activists concerned about either energy efficiency or climate change. But a majority of the congregation don't really think of it as the church's job. They think the church, should visit the sick, donate food to the food pantry, maybe, work with, some organization that builds housing for people. So I think education is a key component for people of faith. The key point, in addition to emphasizing the moral dimension, is to emphasize the urgency of this, which in surveys in Massachusetts going back years, there's always been a high degree of awareness of the problem of climate change, but not as high an awareness of the urgency. Rob DeCanto, an atmospheric scientist from UMass, when he spoke at Cardinal O'Malley's meeting back in 2018, he said, and this is a guy who studies the ice in Antarctica, actually goes down there and is seeing this, so he's not a political hack. he said in 2018, we have 5 years, maybe 10 to get ahead of this problem. Or the sea level rise that might be 2 feet, is going to be this high, 5 to 10 years. And people don't seem to get that, although with the increases in extreme weather, they're getting it. Of the people of faith in Massachusetts, I think Margaret Bullitt Jonas, who's an Episcopal priest, and who's also, I think the term is a non-stipendiary missionary for the United Church of Christ, is probably one of the most effective faith leaders on this issue in the country. And so she's written this collection of essays, which has, discussion questions for churches, and that's a great book. Now, I'm a little bit more familiar with Brooks Burnt's book. Reverend Brooks Burnt is the environmental justice minister at the national setting of the UCC. And he's written a book called Cathedral on Fire. Now, we all know how busy everybody in this state is. Now, Brooks has written a very accessible short book, only 266 pages, I think. But each chapter makes scriptural references, has questions for discussion, but he's got a real knack for explaining the issues in a way which, at least for me, resonated emotionally. And again, I'm going to keep emphasizing that. The other book, Elizabeth Colbert, The Sixth Extinction, talks about the extinctions of various species. And I think for a lot of people, their main connection to creation is through animals. It may be pets, it may be our cats, our dogs, it may be horses, it may be anything. And one of the things that climate change is accelerating is this massive, massive extinction, of species. And she writes in a very compelling way. I first read her book called Field Notes from a Catastrophe about 6 or 7 years. And it reads a little bit dated now, but the word I heard is the process of writing it put her into a clinical depression. It's a very, very powerful book. And parts that I remember is talking about how, it has disrupted the lives of Inuits and, natives in the Northern Hemisphere.
Well, this is
three
so
that I would recommend.
Well, listen, though, the one local one is Margaret Bullitt Jonas. Maybe I should try and make contact with her and see if we can't interview her in connection with perhaps reading the book. I'll certainly get a hold of it myself first. These are all great. You've probably met her and know her.
Oh yeah, I've worked with Margaret for years, and she's just fantastic. Just fantastic.
Well, that'll be next. Well, listen, what about the latest, what are the developments in environmental technology that we should know about? I mean, we're all quite aware of wind and solar energy devices and the industry around it, except I shouldn't say we're all aware of it, but I'm certainly familiar with those myself. My wife and I installed solar panels on our home in the Berkshires. Right off the bat, there was an initiative by the state to recruit towns to do campaigns. And so there were, I don't know, there were 28 or 30 in the town of Lee alone. Lee is a little town at exit 2 on the pike. Anyway, what's evolved lately that should attract our attention?
Yeah, well, first I want to just say that the holy trinity of climate change response is conservation, efficiency, and renewables. So there's 3 different things. So in terms of efficiency, you think, well, if you have a hybrid car, maybe you're getting 50 miles a gallon as opposed to 25 miles a gallon. But I remember at an event, bragging about the mileage of our 2008 Toyota Prius. And some gentleman who must have been close to 80 said, Toyota Prius, you know, I rode my bike here 15 minutes and this was at night. So I think we're all inclined to move towards efficiency because it's part of the American commercial social ethic that, you know, efficiency is good. But really, if you conserve, so either don't use energy or do what you need to do without burning fossil fuels, you're eliminating 100% of any emissions that would be there. Now, I think it's a lot harder to make a shift from a gas guzzler to a Prius than it is from a Prius to a bicycle. But behavior change, which is always the hardest to do, I think is a place where the church has a role in helping people understand that we can have all these great technologies, but if people don't adopt them, it's not going to help. When we used to do enforcement actions against corporations and tell them, we want you to redesign your process. I remember in one case, and take lead out of the process. Lead is, you know, a neurotoxin, which is terrible. And I couldn't even believe in the 90s that, you know, it was being emitted out of stacks in Massachusetts without any controls. And they eventually did change the process, but the defense is always, well, we're going to need consumer acceptance to make this work. So, you know, our behavior, our consumer acceptance is really critical. But in terms of the technologies, you know, the three big are wind, solar, and geothermal. And because of the scale of wind, the amount of electricity that it can generate with these big turbines, I think there's a pretty strong consensus that that will be the main technology that will be necessary to shift from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable energy economy. And, you know, people know about some of the offshore wind developments, and the current law pushes for another, you know, installment of wind development offshore, but the potential is vastly greater than is being realized right now. Solar is another excellent renewable technology. We had great success with solar technology on churches. I think we helped about 45 of the 90 churches that have solar in Massachusetts get it. And Massachusetts has the second highest number of churches with solar in the country after California, which is a much bigger state. Not every roof is right for solar. Not everybody, you know, can make the investment. Anybody in Massachusetts can go online and find electricity providers that will provide 100% renewable energy at the same or lower cost than the fossil fuel providers.
I wish we could talk more about that. Maybe we'll do it after the interview, and I'll translate it into our other media. But I get brochures and flyers, I guess everybody does, in the mail about these renewable energy sources for electricity. And I never know how to evaluate them and so forth.
Yeah, there's a lot of what we call greenwash out there. The Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities has a site, and I'll go back and send it to you if you like.
Yeah.
Basically compares the major suppliers of renewable energy, and it gives the price and it gives the percentage of renewables. And some of them require a 6-month commitment, a year, 2 years. Some of them, the rate floats. But I have for years been getting 100% renewable, you know, at a supply cost of 11 cents a kilowatt hour, which is typically half of the total electricity cost for years.
I'm going to follow this up with you so that we can translate it into another medium. It takes real concentration, and I want this education to be captured in a way that people can use it. I mean, conversationally, and this has been a great conversation. This has been just golden, Vince, and we've come to the end of our time, but
Can I just add one thing? Because
By
I
all
would feel
means.
bad if I didn't. So, I talked about thinking about this as analogous to a calling in sort of my life experience with advocacy, but we really need to build a movement in this country. And that's where activism and demonstrations and organizations like 350 Massachusetts and the Sunrise Movement come in. And I would urge people who maybe don't feel a calling in one direction or another to get involved with one of those organizations. 350 Mass does a great job.
Mhm.
I've been blown away by how effective young people at the Sunrise Movement have been, and it's really critical to just build the movement.
This is really terrific. I'll capture it on paper, but anyone who's been listening, I hope you were taking notes and joining the spirit of this conversation. Vince, thank you so much. You retired, but you've also been succeeded by another executive director who will be our next guest on these interviews, Reverend Fred Small, who's well known in Boston, a Unitarian minister and an environmental activist, obviously. So we'll have a 1-2 punch here, if that's the right metaphor to use, on the environment. So I'm going to sign us off with thanks again to you, Vince, and we'll talk and follow up again together.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick, and thanks for your great leadership at Elliott. We really love you.
Oh, bless your heart. Thank you. And the feeling is mutual. Okay, bye for now.